the Akashic record 80,000 years ago and saw what Blavatsky described as a truncated pyramid. And I was in that pyramid back in the Akashic record, and I could see that the grand gallery was actually used as a telescope. The drawing is here. If anybody wants to look at it later, we'll put it up. But the top surface of the pyramid at 50 stone height, Blavatsky said, was engraved astrological symbols of the zodiacal signs and the planets that they were aware of at that time, which actually was the beginning of a type of esoteric astrology that's very similar to what students of esoteric astrology are using nowadays. So we're looking at the Giza Plateau. Get this back here. The region where the pyramids existed, just west of this little green flower-like, lotus-like flower at the tip of the Nile River. So we talked about it last week. We have some new information that we want to give out tonight. And in order to understand the Mediterranean region, which is really kind of the basis of our lecture from last week and from this week, and will be also next week with another PowerPoint presentation that we have, try to explain some ideas about Atlantis. This map shows Poseidon. I'll have to get my, which I believe, and other people that I know, and particularly initiate people, say it didn't really exist. There's no scientific proof. It was not a granitic landmass. It was not a basaltic. There's no evidence of either on the ocean floor. And so it's something that was dreamed up by Ignatius Donnelly largely. And people assumed that in Plato's Timaeus, when he talked about that Atlantis existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that they thought the opening between North Africa and Spain was the Pillars of Hercules, back in ancient times known as that they meant beyond those, and out in somewhere in the mid-Atlantic existed the island of Atlantis, or sometimes they call it a city, sometimes they call it a continent. They use various names to identify. We're going to try to clarify some of that tonight. But what's interesting, great theosophical clairvoyant, probably the greatest clairvoyant that ever lived, had visions of this all being a vast, shallow sea, what is now the Sahara Desert. It's interesting too, he notes here, you want to keep this in mind. There's an island right there that will play in to the lecture both tonight and next week. Now, in an appallingly brief period of time, I have to, what do we have, 40 minutes? I have to give a lecture that covers what could conceivably be 1,000,000 years of history. But we're going to go back to maybe 250,000 years here. And when the Sahara Desert was a shallow sea. Leadbeater said in his writings that when Atlantis was destroyed, the surviving members sailed to the Giza Plateau, which would be actually over here, somewhere in this region, sailed to the Giza Plateau. And they reestablished what eventually became Egypt, the Atlanteans. The present-day Egyptians really don't bear any resemblance to the Atlanteans, who were a terracotta colored skinned race of people. And they are what we call the fourth root race, members of the fourth root race, but so are the Chinese, so are the American Indians. Each root race has 7 subraces. Each subrace has 7 tribes. Each root race has a Manu figure that Moses in the Bible, the Judaic Christian religions, is the Manu figure of ancient Judaism. Manus are lawgivers, and they're also progenitors of a race. That means that their DNA is of a certain atomic vibration, and that they interbreed with the evolving female human species of a particular tribe or root race. A lot of the modern day programs that you see about ancient aliens, they're hitting on this idea, but they don't either know the esoteric teachings, which they should know, but don't, and leave it up to guys like me to try to explain it. But it's their conjecture. And of course, it's always spacemen and guys in flying saucers, which is not the case at all. But anyway, this map is important because it tells us something about that part of the world and how it has changed over millions of years. The Mediterranean Sea at one time did not exist. It's prone to tremendous dehydration. If the Straits of Gibraltar were closed off, the rivers that flow into it from wherever they are in the world, primarily the Nile, but others, it couldn't sustain itself and would be just a vast salt desert. They know scientifically that the floor of the Mediterranean is almost 2 miles thick of salt from previous inundations of salt water that flowed in and then eventually dried up through cataclysmic geological changes that took place. It dried up, filled up again. We're talking millions of years. I think one of the estimates was 55 to 60 million years ago. This process has been going on. As long also, about every 20,000 years, the Sahara Desert changes. It changes from a grassland plain into a desert, back into a grassland plain with lakes, huge freshwater water lakes. We know that there's a huge, what they call the Ethiopian limestone aquifer under the Sahara Desert. In fact, I've had friends that have been there recently, outside of Cairo, in the desert. I'm not talking about the pyramids. I'm talking about being in the desert where the water is actually bubbling up out of the ground. And it may have a great price in the future. Here shows some of the ancient rivers and channels and the watershed for the Saharan Desert. Like I said, it hasn't always been a desert. We'll see some examples of this as we move through these pictures. Yeah, this is stating that beneath the sands of the Sahara Desert, scientists have discovered evidence of a prehistoric mega lake formed 250,000 years ago when the Nile River pushed through a low channel near Wadi Tushka. It flooded the eastern Sahara, creating a lake that at its highest level covered more than 42,000 square miles. Also, we probably should go back here for just a minute. The Nile River did not always flow out into the Mediterranean. It turned here and flowed inland. And it's believed that the Atlantean people actually dug a channel. There's an interesting story behind this, to create this delta that's very full of agriculture. Gets a lot of water. It also, from the sky, it apes the image of a lotus flower. And along the Nile River at places like Luxor and whatever the other names are, I can't remember. I think Karnak might be in there. There are these temples. There are 7 temples. And some people believe that the later pyramid, when it was finally completed to the height of a capstone, that initiations in those big stone sarcophagi were taken. And one of the things that the initiate, who was placed into the stone, immense stone sarcophagus, had to astrally project. And they would project out over Luxor and see the temples. And they would then, after 3 days, they would describe their visions that they had seen along the Nile, where they had never been before. But part of their training was to astrally project to those locations, and it was proof in their description that whether they were successful or not. So there's the immense lake. There were actually, many people believe there were 3 lakes in the desert, but this proves here, these are stone carvings that are in caves in the Sahara Desert that show giraffes, people hunting giraffes with bows and arrows, probably 20,000 years old. These descriptions, there was all kinds of abundant life. Lions, giraffes, elephants, all across the Sahara Desert. It's an interesting consideration. And they say that it corresponds with the rotation of the earth, how the axis pivot a few degrees every 20,000 years. And when it turns, when the earth pivots on this axis, is when you have periods of inundation, grassland plains, and then it pivots back and the Sahara Desert appears once again. So here's a pretty typical story. We talked about it last week of the Sphinx, and that the certain experts, Robert Schoch, who's an expert on water erosion, says that the actual stone, limestone of the pyramid is a victim not of wind rain erosion, or not of wind sand erosion, but of wind rain erosion, because the formations on the stone are very rounded and soft. I don't know if we've got a picture of that or not, but it's a completely different kind of erosion, which again tells us that this at one time was a grassland area, very different from today. We also last week talked about this structure of the Sphinx, and initiate beings have told us that this head of this being here at one time may have been a lion, but it may have been something before that. And it's believed that this land around this is flooded. It's silt brought in by tremendous flooding. However it was caused, we don't know. We can only guess at what it was. But that at one time, when this was originally carved, this was a man who was standing here. And we showed that image over here. I have a picture of it on the side. A man, and he could be seen from the valley below when the Mediterranean was not filled with water. And itself was a meadow land. The Mediterranean at one time was a meadowland. It had lakes, had rivers, antelope, all kinds of animal life. So it's an interesting consideration, but that could have been, who knows, 80,000 years or more ago. It's worth thinking about. It's worth considering. So there's a picture of it there, and you can see from these rounded stones that it would appear to, even to us who are not trained geologists and experts in water erosion, that, yeah, this is probably wind, rain erosion. And that's what Robert Schoch says, that this is all caused by a completely different climate that existed and has traveled through many cycles, many periods in the existence of the statues and the pyramids on the Giza Plateau. I don't think we care too much about that. A Chinese pyramid. It's interesting because these are remnants of the Atlantean root race. And so they were the Chinese people, they were building pyramids too, which is part of the whole Atlantean culture and the initiates who comprised the spiritual hierarchy of the Atlantean sub-races. And so the pyramids are known throughout the world. We'll try to explain that. It's a little bit abstruse, but if you have any knowledge of the root races and the sub-races, then you would know that Vaivasvatu, or the Manu whoever was, sometimes they call him the same name in the fourth root race as they do in the fifth root race, but that this great Moses-like being, again, influenced the laws and the DNA of evolving races of people, from Lemuria up to right now, the Aryan race or the fifth root race. Here's an example here of another structure in China. It's built very similar to what we see in South America. People wonder how and why that could be. Well, they were initiate priests that were training them and teaching them, and they exist all over the world, and they incarnate variously. The people just didn't stand on the street corner one day and decide to build pyramids in China that corresponded to pyramids in South America. It's not the way it works. So you have to factor into the equation the idea of initiate teachers who have always existed. So here's another example of a pyramid in Spain. Spain, some experts, people who claim to be experts, I don't claim to be an expert, but some people say that, yeah, these were Atlantean outposts, and they probably were. And some guys have devoted 40 years of their life or more trying to explain the belief that Atlantis existed somewhere in Spain, in the marshland area of Spain. It may have been an outpost, but there's a lot of interesting structures like this around the world. One of the things that we talked about last week, but only briefly hit on it, I think, Randy, somebody turn the light on there, because we want to look at this picture over here of can you get that? Of the Bosnian pyramid. And the picture up in the corner is a picture of Samuel Osmaganic, who was the man who discovered the Bosnian pyramids. And I met him down the street here at the Hilton Hotel, must have been 10 years ago. And he has the belief, he says, that he can prove that those pyramids are 25,000 years old because of organic material that was uncovered in these cement slabs. What they did was they took these existing hills, like you see here, and they shaped them into a pyramidal shape and then covered them with these huge cement, man created cement slabs and covered it as if they were aping the pyramids of Egypt. And the question is, why would they do that? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. But anyway, these are interesting to show you the size of these. Here's the Great Pyramid of Egypt, 450 feet tall, and the Pyramid of the Sun, which is the Great Pyramid of Bosnia, is 722 feet, almost twice the height. And my hypothesis that I have is that in one of the great periods of inundation, and we know that the pyramids were flooded because we've found sea creatures inside the pyramids and signs of sea life inside the pyramids that could only have been flooded and quite high. The water was quite high inside inside the pyramids, where these sea creatures have existed. So the thing that's interesting about it is that if you go around the perimeter of the, here's some prehistoric structures that are similar to the structures of pyramids around the world in Wales, in Monmouth, Wales. One of the things that I'm trying to bring out tonight is to tie the pyramids in Egypt together with the pyramids in Bosnia and the structures at Göbekli Tepe, also with Atlantis. And we have a wonderful PowerPoint for next week that will go through and explain the comment that Plato made in the Timaeus in what was it, 360 BC. He said that that Atlantis existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And the Pillars of Hercules are commonly thought by academia to be the Straits of Gibraltar. But there was a second Pillars of Hercules. And I was told by Douglas Baker, who's a teacher and a prolific author of esoteric books in the 20th century, that I should pursue that and follow it to its end, which I eventually did. It took me a lot longer than I had planned to do it. But the second set of these Pillars of Hercules is on a peninsula off the coast of, off the tip of Morocco. And they're well known and documented, not well known in the sense that the Straits of Gibraltar are known, but it does give us another way to approach our understanding of the Pillars of Hercules and what it might lead us to. We'll talk about that. Here's another a Teotihuacan immense pyramid in South America, and beautifully created. And again, they were part of the Atlantean root race, the South American Indians, the same as the Red American Indians. They're all parts of an Atlantean root race, whether they're first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh subrace. They're connected to the what we call the Atlantean root race, similar but different from what we call the Atlanteans of Atlantis per se, the continent that disappeared overnight, or the island city that disappeared overnight. They call it all these, one minute they're calling it a continent, the next minute they're calling it an island, and the next minute they're calling it a city. So what we're concerned about as I said earlier, is the basin of the Mediterranean and how it may have been settled. That's my hypothesis that I'm going to try to explain here tonight. Somebody watching the time?
Yes, almost 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes. This is a cutaway view. And it's interesting because they talk about the large quantities of mercury under the ruins of Teotihuacan. I said last week, for those of you who were here last week, when I talked about being inside the Grand Gallery, what is called the Grand Gallery of the Great Pyramid, that as I stood at the bottom, I could see up through this opening, this grand gallery, out into the daylight sky. And I could see through the daylight sky into the midnight sky. And the only thing that I could assume was that the sunlight was being absorbed down this channel of the pyramid when it was truncated, and that it allowed me to see. I was amazed at how clear I could see into the midnight sky. And what I was seeing, this was actually a telescope. They had built a telescope, the early Atlanteans, in the truncated pyramid. Remember, it was built to a height of 50 stones. It wasn't completed to a height of a capstone. That came later. A later group of initiate teachers completed the structure to a capstone. So Blavatsky says 80,000 years ago, it was truncated. She doesn't say anything about the astrology that I know of or the astronomy, but that's what it was. And I also told you last week that as I looked at the floor of this grand gallery, the telescope, where the lenses were at one time built and were maneuvered back and forth, that there was a pool of mercury. And the image of space in the midnight sky, the dark sky, and the stars and the planets were reflected in a pool of mercury. So in China, they find these too, with mercury rivers and unexplainable other features. So they may have also used those at some time as a reflective vehicle to read the sky. I don't know yet. We don't know. But they certainly did in Egypt, at the Giza Plateau and inside the Great Pyramid. Here's another pyramidal shape in the Mississippi Indian culture, where they built mounds. And I think it's in Chillicothe, Ohio, down on the Ohio River. And also the Serpent Mound is very near there. And so these structures in Missouri and in Ohio and other places were known to exist. I always tell the story about when I was a young kid, there was a tribe of Indians that lived. I grew up in Indiana. There were a tribe of Indians called the Pickways. And these Pickways were all 7 and 8 feet tall American Indians. And they had burial grounds there, mounds. They called them the mound builders. And they were huge people. And I went to art college with a young woman whose mother was a Pickway Indian, one of the very few left in the world. And this girl was, I think she was 6'7". And she was part Pickway Indian. So they were huge people. And they're buried there around north of Indianapolis, around Anderson, Indiana. There's a state park. And they had these moats. They built these moats just like we're going to show on Atlantis, how the Atlantean city was a series of moats of where they could sail their ships in and out of. But it's extraordinary to think about. And again, it's all part of an Atlantean root race, different tribes, different subrace, but connected to the Atlantean root race. Yeah, here's another one in Cambodia. I spent some time in Cambodia. I never saw any of these. I wish I could have. It was something I wanted to do. But again, you can see these pyramidal shapes. They exist all over the world. And it shows the vast the technology and the influence of initiate beings within the Atlantean root race. Canary Islands, same thing. A lot of people think that the Canary Islands are an outpost of Atlantis. And they may have been at one time, but not Atlantis per se. But there you go, similar, very similar structures. So they're found here all over the world, pyramids of different descriptions. Up in here is Bosnia, where these pyramids over here exist on our board that we looked at earlier. So even as we showed earlier up in Wales, some settlement of people of Atlantean extraction. So it takes us back again to the Giza Plateau. I think this might be the last slide in this. Now, here's the Bosnian pyramids. Good. The hypothesis that I'm putting forward, and I'm pretty sure it's right, is that when the Mediterranean had flooded and the area of the Giza Plateau in northern Africa was inundated, the people fled and they moved around the basin of the Mediterranean. And they settled variously at places like Globeki Tepe and at the Bosnian site. And if Osmaganic, the man who discovered the Bosnian pyramids, is correct, and they are 25,000 years old, he thinks his rationale is that they're older than the Egyptian pyramids because the pyramids, scientists say, are what, 5, 6, 7,000 years old. Osmaganic has got it wrong. They may be 25,000 years old, and they've supposedly have proven that with leaves and debris that were in the cement slabs when they poured those slabs, and they've done testing, carbon testing, and found that the leaves are 25,000 years old. The problem for my friend Samuel Osmaganic is that these pyramids are much younger than the pyramids of Egypt by what? 60,000 years, almost 55,000 years older than these pyramids. But he's got it twisted around in his mind that these were the oldest pyramids were built in Bosnia. Not true. Probably the Egyptian or the Atlantean people, as I said, fled the water. Who knows how many years the Giza Plateau was flooded. Could have been hundreds and hundreds of years before the water subsided. Could have been 1,000 years or more. So they reestablished themselves, these Egyptians who fled and constructed this in Bosnia because it was reminiscent of the land from which they came. They were reestablishing their civilization that they had once known that was then at that time flooded. They had to flee for their lives. It's worth consideration, and I think it has merit. The thing that's interesting too is that in Bosnia, I was married to a woman who was a Bosnian Serb, her mother's side of the family, Bosnian Serbs. And from that part of the world come the gypsies. And gypsies is a slang term to be an Egyptian. That's where that comes from. And the gypsies are all over Europe, and in particular in that part of the world. Bosnia, Hungary, all over Europe. Albania,
So
Romania,
you're saying the
Yugoslavia.
Egyptians are the gypsies?
Yeah.
All of them?
Well, I don't know all of them, but many are descendants of the Egyptians,
I see.
of the Atlanteans who lived in Egypt, and where they called them Egyptians. And that's how the whole word gypsy came about. People who had fled Egypt moved up into South Central Europe. And if you even find them in Ireland, Cleveland and Detroit are full. There's a lot of gypsy people in Detroit. I had a good friend in Indiana who's a Romanian gypsy, a very close-knit society. But anyway, there you go. That's part of the mystery. But they've always called them Egyptians or gypsies because they knew for thousands of years that that's where they came from. And they intermarried and mingled with wherever the other people were that lived in that part of the world. It's worth thinking about. Here's a nice map that explains it. So if this was all flooded, which it was at one time, they came around the mouth of the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, fleeing the flooding waters, and settled and spread out through just what I said: Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, so all over. Even up, you see them, but they call them in England Irish gypsies or Irish rovers or something like that. I forget. I have to ask my English friends what they name them, but it's part of the occult history, and we need to understand the occult history. Yeah, here's Visoko. Let's go back. Here's Visoko, which is just outside Sarajevo. That's where the Bosnian pyramids are.
Right.
So here's the Adriatic Sea. So it was probably flooded more. We don't know what the actual topography was, but we can assume fairly reasonably that in an occult perspective, that this is what it was: a settlement, a large settlement. There'll be others that'll be found. Göbekli Tepe is one of those sites in southeastern Turkey that, no doubt about it, it has an Atlantean origin. They haven't found pyramids there yet, but they've found significant structures, architecture, bas reliefs, and to me, it's all connected. It's part of a unifying thread of truth that connects that part of the world. And if you, with Egypt and eventually Atlantis, which we'll see next week in our PowerPoint presentation next week, I think we'll get a glimpse of it here this week. But there again is this tremendous pyramid structure that was a mountain that was carved and shaped like a pyramid and then covered with cement, ancient cement slab. They know how to make cement. If he's right, if Osmogonitz is right, 25,000 years ago or more. And they covered it so it looked like they're pyramids. And we'll see in next week's PowerPoint. I've got some beautiful images of the pyramids of Egypt from an initiative perspective, and how they were the white stone that covered the outer surface of the pyramids were painted. They actually painted them with special paints of elaborate images of Egyptian gods. Of course, it's all worn away, as you would expect. Here's some of the stones and people who are volunteering. A lot of these people are through the there's a world organization that's I can't think of it right now, but it's through the United Nations that this world organization is sending people over there to dig, archaeological digs, to see what they can find. And you can see the slabs are quite large. And I don't know what all they found. There's different theories that Osmogonich has put forth about the Bosnian pyramids. I think some of them are like inaccurate, pie in the sky. Nice guy. And God bless him. He discovered something that he intuitively sensed. And they started digging away and found the Bosnian pyramids, all because of him. This is Göbekli Tepe. And you can see these stones are immense stones. They might weigh 10 tons or more. And they built it primarily in circular groupings, but this is on a hill. Göbekli Tepe means pot-bellied. Means a man laying down with kind of a big belly. And that's what they called the hill. And then somebody found some object, one of these pillars partially sticking out of the ground. It was a German archaeologist, and he began to dig, and lo and behold, they've uncovered this ancient structure, which they say is about 13,000 years old. And so Graham Hancock and some of his people say that it's the oldest civilization, but it isn't. It isn't the oldest civilization. The Atlanteans were much more ancient, and the Lemurians much more ancient than the Atlanteans. The problem with so much of the Lemurian architecture is that it's at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean or the Indian Ocean. And so these are the remains of some ancient city that I believe had its origins with Atlantis and ancient Egypt. And these are some of the reliefs that they carved, almost totem pole-like, various birds and unusual, almost purse-like shapes that you see throughout the Middle East, in Iraq, in Iran, and the architecture and the remains of ancient civilizations of Persia. Just some other pictures of these structures, and I forget what they've uncovered, like a couple of acres, and there may be 100 acres or more yet to dig up. So it's going to take them a very long time, but it's getting more interesting all the time. This is what I had talked to you about earlier. We're out of sequence, and we'll have this for next week. But the pillars of Hercules that were known to the initiate teachers in Plato's time and before, and to the ancient Egyptians or to the ancient Greeks, were two cave openings that exist here that are not physical pillars, but are caves, one above the other. They say that the one they believe might have been made by the Phoenicians. Yeah, it says that here. I'll just read it out loud. The cave has two openings, one to sea and one to land. The sea opening is known as the map of Africa. It is believed that the Phoenicians created the sea opening, which is in the shape of Africa when looked at from the sea. There are also some markings on the wall in the shape of eyes that are said to be made by the Phoenicians, which make up a map of the local area. So when Plato said the Atlantis existed beyond the pillars of Hercules, he was talking about this area right here. It's right here. No, it's right here. I'm sorry. It's right here. And it's completely different than anything any of us could have imagined. And this is what Baker asked me 10, 11 years ago to research. And if you shoot a line from Greece down through that, it will take you into Mauritania, which is where what is called the Eye of Africa exists, which is this structure over here, which perfectly fits Plato's description of the lost city of Atlantis. The dimensions, this is also known as the Eye of Africa. It's called the Rickard structure. Scientists try to explain this as being a geological phenomena where rock was moved up in some way perfectly symmetrical to the surface and created these rings. I don't believe it is. I believe that that is Atlantis. The description of Atlantis and the measurements of the size of this thing can only be seen from the air. And that's how they discovered it, was space satellites taking photographs, thousands of photographs of Northern Africa, and it fits the description. There's even we'll see next week in our slide or our PowerPoint presentation, archaeological artifacts that were found there and around this region. But they believe, certain esotericists believe that, and some scientists, that a massive tsunami washed it away. And that its actual existence, and we don't know what the shoreline of the ocean was. The shoreline could have been much closer, see, at some ancient time, 100,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, whatever it was. So it's interesting speculation. Yeah, they call it the Eye of the Sahara. That's Apollo 9 taking a photograph of it. It's actually the way it was discovered. So it's worth thinking about. We're referring back here to the Akashic Records because the Akashic Records are the best way really of knowing, I think. It was for me when I was inside the pyramid 80,000 years ago. It was an experience in conscious mediumship that involved astral projection also. Blavatsky was a conscious medium. Conscious mediumship is the highest way of knowing. It was just one experience that I had. I was sitting in on the sofa in the room next door when it happened. What was interesting about it, and I didn't know it at the time, I was told about it later. At the very moment that I had this incredible experience of conscious mediumship and awareness of the Akashic record and being back 80,000 years ago, my friend Douglas Baker was talking about the very subject in Italy to about 100 students. So we'll see more with next week's presentation. What time have we got?
8:20.
Its
So
time is
yeah, you
just
wanna
about up.
yeah.
Can they ask questions, people?
Yeah, they can ask questions. You might want to see if anybody wants to ask a question.
Yeah, if anybody wants to ask questions.
They can actually type into chat or they can raise their hand and then I will unmute them.
Okay, all right.
So if anybody wants to ask a question, okay, from Mary Beth.
Mary Beth, yeah.
Okay, she says fascinating topics. That's what she says.
Okay.
Well, there's no questions so far.
Anybody here have any?
How old are the pyramids in Saqqara or Saqqara? Is that how you pronounce that?
In where?
It's Saqqara.
Saqqara?
Yeah, that's south of Cairo by a couple hundred miles, I believe.
Yeah. Those are much younger pyramids. They're not older, they're actually younger. See, what happened was when there came what Baker used to call bastard Egyptian race of people, which is the present day Egyptians, and others, Nubians, saw the pyramids, they wanted to construct their own. And so they built much smaller pyramids. But one of the deep secrets of the construction of the pyramids, people don't know how to interpret it. I think I talked about it last week. Bailey says, Alice Bailey, in her writings, that the pyramids were built from above down. And so some of the Bailey followers thought they had figured out what she meant, and that she meant that they were etheric, and then somehow they solidified it. But that's not it at all. What happened was that on the Giza plateau, there were huge limestone hills, and they cut the stones and slid them down, and they slid them down into place. And it involved ancient Atlantean human beings who were enormous in size, some 12 and 15 feet tall, who worked in squads. These are the initiate teachings. I don't make this stuff up. And they were able to cut the stones. I've seen images of the types of saws they used that were artists' conceptions based on initiate knowledge. And they could cut the stones perfectly and slide them into place. And that's what they did. And there are 17 other additional pyramids buried under the sand just to the west of these pyramids. They know that because they found them through a special form of infrared or some radio technology. 17 other additional pyramids. And the other thing that's interesting, a consideration for us to make, is that off the coast of the Mediterranean, there are 200 and I think 86 known sunken cities around the perimeter of the Mediterranean, which tells you that the water was much lower, and other civilizations lived there. Who knows how ancient those are? But there's a tremendous history. I know there's some argument between the Blavatsky people and the Bailey people about the age of the pyramids, and some of the Blavatsky people said, oh, they're 260,000 years old. Or Bailey did. Bailey said that. And then Blavatsky said 80,000 was the age of the first truncated pyramid that was built to about that height, right there, 50 stones up. So it was later completed to the capstone, but by an entirely different group of initiate priests with another purpose in mind. The astrology had died out, tens of thousands of years had passed, and voila, a new purpose, repurposing the truncated pyramid. So we'll see some really interesting pictures next week with our next PowerPoint on this most interesting subject. Anybody else?
Yeah, so there's a couple comments in here. The one of them is from Rachel saying, fascinating, David, looking forward to learning more about Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is someone name of Siva Prasad.
Mm-hmm. From India.
Okay, good to watch your presentation, David. I could connect and join, although I am in train journey.
He's on a train in India.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's on a train trying to watch it on his iPhone.
Okay.
So he might not have a good connection.
Yeah, actually he's there. I can see him.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
All right.
So did you meet with him in person?
I talked to him the other night. He called. Yeah.
So this is him?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Good to see you.
Yeah, he's
All right. He's waving.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
All right.
Nice. I could, yeah, network is okay, so I could join.
The head of the Theosophical Order of the Service.
Can you hear me?
Wonderful student. Yes.
Yes, yes. So I was thinking that network may not be there, but there is. But there is intermittent disturbances, but still I could join and I could see your presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do it again next week. And I'll
Yes.
have a better PowerPoint
Okay.
presentation for
Okay.
next
Okay.
week.
Yeah.
Same time.
Next week, yeah. I will be at home, so no problem. I can watch.
Okay, good. All
Yeah,
right,
clear.
thank
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
you. People all over the world are interested in this stuff. The people from England, India.
So were there any discovered cities that were underneath the water in the Persian Gulf that you're aware of?
I don't know that I'm aware of, but there could be. Yeah, sure. Yeah. The world is full of mysteries. If you read Leadbeater's book, if you read Blavatsky's writings, these civilizations are ancient, and the geography of the world has changed multiple times. Yes,
I'm just showing you who is online so that way
Okay.
you know them.
right.
And
I don't.
Kimberly,
Oh, Kimberly, yeah. Hi, Kimberly.
okay, you cannot hear them, but Galloway,
Oh, is that Michelle Galloway?
Michelle Galloway, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
then
good. Okay. Yeah.
Neil, Rachel Hayton,
Yeah,
and Mary Beth,
Sandra.
and all these other people. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can
I
see
don't
some
know
of
them
them.
all. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, good. Well, we'll do it again next week, and I'll have a different PowerPoint presentation.
Also,
but,
there's some question also.
what?
We live by Black Mountain that is combination of huge sandstone and black shell. Geological anomaly. I have often wondered if it is a pyramid. I have observed many mountains on the reservation in Arizona and New Mexico that is shaping like pyramids. And Mirbas is saying thank you. And this is from the Michelle Galloway, the question. So I don't know.
That was about mountains in Arizona.
Yeah.
Don't
Black
know anything about it. Black
Mountains, yeah.
Mountain. I don't know anything about that. I can't comment on it.
Yeah, Black Mountain is, it's a geological anomaly. The geologists can't figure out how it occurred. Half of it is black shell, and the other half is giant boulders, very similar to what was in your pictures. And no one has been able to figure out how it was formed. And then also there's many places on the Dene Reservation where there's in the middle of nowhere, where there's no other mountains, there's mountains that are shaped just like pyramids. So,
Well, I didn't know about that. That's good. I'm glad you told me about that.
and then also in Phoenix, outside of Phoenix, there's a Indian run where the people just disappeared, and there's a theory. You might want to get the book named Corn Man. Man Corn, I'm sorry. And it's a geologist from Arizona State University that studied the remains of several of the Indian ruins, where his theory is that a lot of the bones were actually used to stir pots, and that some of the tribes were turned cannibalistic when they had a shortage of food source from flooding. And then also the Phoenix canals, of course, are quite famous. So. And I know I've lived several places in Phoenix where one place I lived in particular actually stopped the construction of a freeway because of Indian ruins being found, and they were more adobe structure. But there's many, many places. We met with Grandfather Martin, who is now deceased. He was a Hopi elder who was a keeper of the tablets. A tablet keeper. He knew about the gates of the gods and the alignment of the stars. And he said that when the stars align a certain way, the groundwater of the planet recedes and the ocean rises.
Yeah, there's constant geological changes of rising oceans and falling oceans and land masses changing, and that's why it's difficult to give a lecture like this, because we don't have ancient maps. The only thing that we have remotely close are the maps that C.W. Leadbeater drew based on his clairvoyant vision of what that part of the world looked like at 50,000 years, 100,000 years, 250,000 years ago. There may be other ones somewhere in the world, maybe in a Lamasery in Tibet or in India, but I don't have access to those. But they exist somewhere. I remember years ago, I think there are globes in Tibet, hidden in Tibet, that show the different continental arrangements of the continents through periods of millions of years. They actually have globes that show what it looked like in the past and what it will be in the future. And you can go online and see. I just did earlier today, there were examples of Pangea and what the world looked like, 300 million years ago, and how the continents broke up. And of course, we're all aware of that. But
8:33.
it's what?
8:33.
It's 8:33. Okay. All right. So we're going to have to go. That's our time limit is expired. So if there's anybody left online, we'll get together next week.
Yes, everybody's there still watching, so you might want to say
Okay. Goodbye, folks. Goodbye. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah.
okay.
Very good. Thank you.
We meet again.